So we're going to look at the cerebrum on the next page. Mac and cheese. The largest, most complicated area of the brain, we got the cerebral cortex, the winding outer layer, about 1.5 square feet. And then we're going to divide our brain into two halves, cerebral hemispheres. When we're talking about the cerebral cortex, we're talking about that outer layer of the brain that you're familiar with seeing, and we'll see here some graphics shortly. But that outer winding layer of what we call cerebral cortex is what looks like that bulbous mac and cheese. You got gyri and sulci, right? And all you people familiar with anatomy and physiology, you'll understand what that is. 1.5 square feet's like that, right? How's that going to fit in here? I'm going to crumble it up like tinfoil is how it's going to fit in there. Why do we see all these things bunched up? To increase surface area. Thank you. That's right. I can cram it all in here and fit it into this tiny space and have lots of functional tissue to work with. Right, so we see that cramming up in multiple areas of the body, right? The intestines being one of those most obvious examples. So what you have is these folds and folds and folds of neural tissue that really are the hallmark of higher thinking, especially in the frontal lobe, and we'll talk about the lobes. But moreover, we got brain that is divided in two, which is fascinating. Divided in two, but engaging in parallel processing, simultaneous, right? You sometimes, we're using that computer analog, talk about having two hard drives in a computer, right? Well, if it runs fast enough, you don't notice that it's two hard drives. It's simultaneous function, apparently, but what you have is actual time of travel from signal from one half of the brain to the other half of the brain. You have some parallel parts and you have some differentiation. Laterality is the degree of differentiation. So cerebral laterality is what we're talking about, where one function is more represented in one hemisphere than it is in the other. It's not that you don't have both functions represented. It just seems like that we have left brain and right brain dominance for certain kinds of activities. So the left hemisphere is largely thought to control language, right? Logic, language, things of that nature. It doesn't mean it doesn't occur in the right hemisphere, but then the right hemisphere is thought to be more spatially oriented, more artistically oriented, more imagery oriented, so that you have some differentiation, but you have some redundancy. So if you lose tissue in one side, it's possible that you lose an entire function. But it's also possible that, depending on the type of ability we're talking about, you have some representation of that ability in the other side. So you have redundant function in some cases. So if we look at cerebral hemispheres, I'm going to demonstrate this with the left hemisphere. An aphasia is a language impairment that's caused by left hemispheric damage. And that damage could, as I said, be an external insult. You take a blow to the head from whatever source, or it could be an internal insult, either a tumor, stroke. And that would cause the tissue to die in that area. Now, you may watch TV and see the commercials talking about the brain science of neuroplasticity. Well, it's not the brain science of neuroplasticity. It's just neuroplasticity. You have neurons that are the functional units of the whole system, as you now appreciate. You have nerves, which are bundles of axons that come from thousands upon thousands and then hundreds of thousands, right, of these various neurons. And when one neuron dies, it's dead. You're not getting a bunch of new neurons. But what the other neurons near it have the capacity to do, as amazing as it is detect the damage and redirect their own growth. And the neuroplasticity, plasticity meaning just it's malleable, it's changeable, is that it can grow its dendrites through the damaged area or its axons through the damaged area and essentially recover function depending on how extensive the damage is. So if you lose a function with stroke, for example, you might see some gradual recovery of that function as those other neurons in the surrounding area attempt to take over that ability. But if it's too extensive, you won't see a recovery or significant recovery of that function. So if we have an aphasia, and we're talking about areas of the brain, and we're going to talk about lobes, and I want to give this to you as a helpful thing to remember lobes of the brain. We've got a Broca's aphasia, which is the damage is at the Broca's area of the brain. The Broca's area of the brain is in the frontal lobe. Now, we're going to talk about the frontal lobe. It's involved in planning, right? It's involved in deliberation. And so what you have is a person who understands language, which is receptive language, but cannot speak language, although their vocal cords are fine. The mechanical apparatus, thus, is perfectly engaged for talking, but the person cannot command the muscles to do what they need to do to produce speech, which is fascinating. Paul Broca discovered this with a patient, and this was a long time ago, way before brain imaging techniques. The only way they could confirm what they believed, which was that there was probably some damage in this area of the brain that they now call Broca's area, was to do an autopsy after death. And what they found was a massive lesion in that area of the brain, which allowed this person to be able to receive language, but all he could say was 10, 10, 10, 10. He could just stutter a syllable or two syllables, and occasionally he could cuss. He would get so frustrated that he would blurt out a word that was, a discernible cuss word, but he could not actually chain together the muscular procedure to speak what was on his mind. Could write what he wanted to say. You see what I'm saying? He's thinking fine. And this is what I'm talking about. Practical knowledge, when you see people in your life that lose function and you go, what happened? These are the kinds of events that are occurring with brains that cause functionality to be lost. So here's a person who understands language, could write language, can, in other words, communicate, but cannot speak because a specific area of the frontal lobe was damaged, particularly in the left hemisphere. Contrast that with Verna Key. Verna Key's area has to do with speech comprehension, receptive language, right? So Broca's is expressive language, not being able to express oneself verbally, right? This is somebody hearing language that can't understand it, but they can speak it. They can talk logically, they can think logically, but when they're hearing information, they can't make out what it means. They can read language fine, because that's a different area of the brain that's involved, also associated with language. So we're talking about multiple areas of the brain. Reading is more dominant with the occipital lobe, but hearing language has more to do with the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe seems to be critical in the left hemisphere for understanding spoken language. Now, when you understand any language, all you're doing is creating symbol systems in your mind, models for taking raw sounds and interpreting meaning from them. And you've all had the experience of not being able to fully hear somebody and trying to figure out what they said. But imagine being able to hear them completely well, but not be able to make out anything that they say. And that's what we're talking about. That's Verna Key's aphasia. Now, let me give you a mnemonic to help you remember this for your test, right? Broca is like broken speech. Can't say what you want to say. It's broken, right? Verna Key, I don't even know what Verna Key is. I don't understand Verna Key. I don't understand. I don't understand what's being said to me when I hear Verna Key. Broken speech and Verna Key, I don't understand. So Verna Key's area is the temporal lobe, left hemisphere, and I can't understand what's being said because of damage to that specific area of the brain. And Broca's area, frontal lobe of the left hemisphere, where I can't say what I want to say because of specific damage to that area of the brain. So that gives you a sense for the functionality and laterality, right? So we see that language being mostly housed in the left hemisphere gets more profoundly damaged with insults to particular areas of the brain in that hemisphere. The corpus callosum is what attaches them together. That's where you get signals running across from one side to the other side. We talked about the thalamus as a junction box. Well, what you have is a routing of sensations to both sides of the brain. The optic nerve, for example, coming from the eyes, going back to the occipital lobe, actually crosses over an optic chiasm, and it's delivering information from both eyes to both halves of the brain. And the corpus callosum is what facilitates information being transferred from one side to the other side. And they discovered this kind of serendipitously. What does serendipitously mean? That's a damn fancy word. It just means by accident. They had patients who were severe epileptics in a time period before neuroleptic medication, so you couldn't control it with drugs because drugs didn't exist to control it. And what they found is they could do brain surgery, and if they didn't kill the patient and they severed the corpus callosum, seizures stopped. You prevented seizures. Now, you would think by taking out the communication between the two halves, you would severely impair that person's function in the world. But it didn't happen. They functioned fine. They functioned as if nothing happened at all, which is weird. Now, why does that work? Well, the way I liken what I like an epileptic seizure to is like an electrical storm. Like lightning storm, it's random, right? When we exist in our world, everything in proper order, working order, we have very systemized function in our brain. We fire neurons all the time, but in an orderly fashion. If you can imagine neurons firing in a random fashion, that's what is the heart of a seizure. The reason you can see a seizure, right, is because the motor cortex that drives movement is also firing random, which is why you get random jerky movements, because they're uncoordinated movements, because they are random firing neurons like in an electrical storm. Well, for whatever reason, it seems if you can divide the hemispheres so that the storm cannot transfer from one hemisphere to the other, you can prevent seizures. And the storm quiets quicker, and people are better off. But that is a very, very last resort type of thing. Nowadays, we have a lot of other options that we're aware of, that they weren't aware of, but that taught us something about the function of the brain. And how they found that it had anything to do with anything was when they started doing very specialized kinds of studies where they would divide the patient's visual field with a partition and show them objects. Now, you remember that both eyes previously crossed over and fed information to both sides of the brain. But now you're getting the right eye feeding to the right hemisphere and the left eye feeding to the left hemisphere, right? And that's when you could see the difference. You would show somebody a pen, for example, and if they saw it with the left hemisphere and the left eye, they could say it was a pen, they could write the word pen, but they couldn't draw it. If they saw it in their right visual field but not the left visual field, in other words, the right hemisphere was what's perceiving it dominantly, then they could draw it, but they couldn't say it or write it, which is fascinating. So you see that integration is important, but it's such a sophisticated system that even removing the full integration of both halves, you still have almost full functionality. Why? Because you don't have a partition between people's visuals, right? In real life, they still have both eyes operating in both hemispheres simultaneously. Therefore, you have a perception is not as effective as you might think it would be.